Day went black at 4 in the afternoon. It did not cloud over. It did not storm. Something came up out of the north that had no name yet in any weather book. A wall of solid earth, standing from the ground to the top of the sky, a mile high and rolling, brown-black, and boiling slowly forward like a wave that had decided not to fall. Ahead of it, the light turned yellow, then copper, then the color of a jar of old water. Under that light, in the middle of a bare field in the Oklahoma Panhandle, stood a dead truck, a man, and a 9-year-old boy. Home was a mile south. The house, the boy's mother, the baby, the door. Every bone in the boy pointed at it. He was already leaning into a run. 10 steps from the truck, his father caught him by the shoulder and turned him the other way, away from home, away from his mother, toward a low mound of sod at the edge of the north pasture, the old dugout, the dirt house the family had lived in once and left with relief, the home they had spent 6 years being quietly ashamed of. To understand why a father runs his son away from home with the sky falling, and why the earth house they had abandoned was about to pay back every year of that shame, you have to go back to the morning of that same day. Sunday, April the 14th, 1935. The morning, as it happened, was beautiful. That was the trap. By 1935, the people of the High Plains had been living inside the dust for 4 years, and they had gotten good at it, the way people get good at anything. Dust in the bread, dust in the milk strained out through cloth. Dust drifted against the fences like brown snow. Dust in the schoolhouse inkwells. Dust in the lungs of the old and the young, which the doctors had begun to speak of carefully. The storms came so often, they had grades, like eggs. People sealed their windows with gummed tape and rags, hung wet sheets, and went on. Fear had worn out. What was left was endurance. Cal Mercer was 40, and he had done what everyone had done. He had come out in 26, in the wheat boom, when rain seemed steady and wheat was money. And he had broken his section of the old buffalo sod with his own tractor, torn up grass that had held that ground down for 1,000 years, and planted wheat in its place. Then the rain stopped, and the wheat died, and the wind found the naked field. Cal never preached about it, then or later. He said it one way once and let it stand. They had undressed this country, and the country had stood up. He had a wife, June, and a boy, Roy, 9, and a baby girl. And he had 2 houses, which mattered on this day more than anything else he owned. The frame house they lived in, board built in 29 when things were good, and out by the north pasture, dug into a low rise, the first house, the dugout. Sod walls, sod roof, 1 room in the ground. Roy had been born in it. The family had moved up and out of it the way families did, and it stood now half shamed and half forgotten, a storehouse for broken harness. Then came the 14th of April, and the morning was clean. Not decent, clean. The first true blue morning in weeks. The wind lay down. The sun came up scrubbed, and the whole Panhandle walked out of doors and turned its face up like one person. There was church. There was visiting. Bedding came out onto lines all over the county. Windows were thrown open. Women aired what could be aired. After weeks under the brown siege, the country breathed out. In the afternoon, Cal took the truck and the boy north to the far windmill to mend the pump for the last few head of cattle he had left. It was the kind of small Sunday work a man does with his son when the weather has finally given him a day. They had an hour of it, wrenches and sunshine, the windmill clanking easy overhead. Then the birds came over. The ducks came first. They came out of the north, low, much too low, and fast, in ragged strings, and they made no sound at all. Then geese, the same, silent and hurrying. And then the little birds, all of them at once, every sparrow and blackbird in the north half of the county, coming over the wire like a thrown net, flying a foot off the ground. Cal Mercer straightened up off the pump with a wrench in his hand and looked at the birds and then past them. The northern horizon was not sky anymore. It was a coastline. A long, dark shore of something stood on the land's edge, from west clear to east, and it was getting taller. Not a cloud. Clouds have light in them. This was earth. Earth off the fields of Kansas and the Dakotas, and every plowed acre for 300 miles, up and walking. When the birds run silent, his own father would have said, count in minutes. They loaded in seconds. Tools in the box, boy in the cab, and Cal put his foot on the starter. Nothing. Not a cough. He tried again. The engine was as dead as a stone under the hood, and now, in the yellow-going light, the air itself had begun to behave wrongly. Roy's hair was lifting off his head in fine strands, floating, as if the boy were underwater. Tiny blue sparks ticked along the hood seam. When Cal touched the doorframe, it bit him like a wasp. He knew what it was, because 4 years of dusters had taught the whole plains their electric secret. A big roller carried its own charge the way thunderheads do. Enough static to knock a man down off a fence wire, enough to short an engine's magneto to sleep. It was why half the trucks in the county dragged a chain off the back bumper, grounding themselves like church lightning rods. His own chain was in the barn. The truck was not going to run until the storm let it. He stood one breath and did the figuring that mattered. Home, a mile south, downwind, June and the baby and the walls, and a mile of open, featureless field between, with the light dying. The dugout, 300 yards east, across the plowed quarter. The wall, minutes out, and eating the north as he watched. The truck itself he ruled out in the next breath, a slatted cab full of gaps, parked in a low swale that every duster on record had drifted full to the glass. A man who sheltered there was choosing a metal box in a ditch. Roy was already 10 steps gone, running for home, for his mother, the way a 9-year-old's legs decide these things without asking him. Cal caught him by the shoulder and turned him east, away from home, and this once he did not explain, because there was no time to explain the worst fact of a black roller, that a mile downwind, blind, with the storm at your back, is not a walk home. It is a circle you die in your own field, sometimes 100 steps from your own door. The dust did that to people every year. The county had buried some of them. They ran east across the plowing. As they ran, Cal pulled the canteen off his shoulder and did the thing that had to hurt to do. He poured the drinking water out, all of it, soaking 2 bandanas through, and knotted one over the boy's nose and mouth and one over his own. Water in the throat was comfort. Water in the cloth was breath. The lungs outrank the tongue in a duster, every time. Behind them, the wall took the sun. The light went from copper to brown, from brown to a dirty dusk, and then the day was simply removed. Noon to midnight between 2 breaths, the boy said afterward, and no one ever improved on his description. The blackness was not like night. Night has a sky in it somewhere. This was the blackness of a root cellar with the door shut, total, pressing, and full of moving sand that stung the back of the neck like thrown grit. A man's hand disappeared at the end of his own arm. Distance died. Direction died with it. What was left was the ground itself, and this was the knowledge Cal Mercer had brought them east for. The quarter they were crossing was his own plowing, and the furrows ran dead east, straight at the dugout rise. A furrow under your boot soles is a rail. Eyes were useless, feet were not. He put Roy in front of him, both hands on the boy's shoulders, and they walked the furrow blind, soul feeling for ridge and hollow, the plowed land steering the plowman. Breathing was work. Even through the wet cloth, the grit got in, fine as flour and ground between the teeth. Talking was out of the question. Open your mouth, and the storm filled it. Cal squeezed the boy's shoulders for signals. Left, right, steady, and the boy walked. Once, Roy stumbled off the furrow. He went down over a clod, rolled, came up a step to the side, and in that one step, the rail was gone. 3 seconds, they stood in screaming blackness with no line under their feet, unattached to the earth, and those 3 seconds put the gray in that part of the story forever after. Then Cal swept his boot in a slow arc, found the ridge, set the boy's feet back on it, and the world had a spine again. He did not let himself think about June. She had walls and sheets and scents. Her fight was her own. His was 300 yards long and 1 furrow wide. The furrow ran them, at last, into the old corral rails at the dugout, and the top rail bit Cal's palm with a snap of blue fire he felt to his elbow. Everything metal and half the wood in that storm carried its sting. He worked down the rails by forearm, not palm, until the rise of the dugout roof stood against his knee. The door was buried. A dust drift lay against it knee-deep, packed by the wind like brown snow, and they dug it out with their hands, Cal on his knees with his back to the storm, making a wall of himself, Roy hooked to his belt, handful after handful in the dark. The door gave. They fell through it together into blackness. But it was still blackness, standing blackness, air that did not move, in a room that did not howl. They were inside the earth, and the storm, for all its mile-high walking wall, could not follow them down. The dugout held, and it held the way no board house on the plains held that day. Sod walls 2 feet thick do not rattle. Sod does not gap and whistle and breathe dust at every seam the way milled lumber does. The roar overhead came through muffled and far, like weather in the next county. The house the Mercers had left with relief in '29, the dirt-floored, dark, low, shame-faced first house, stood around them now like a root cellar built by a fortress-minded man, which is exactly what a dugout is. They made it livable by feel. The old tick mattress, kept there for the seed potatoes, went against the foot of the door, chinked into the gap. They sat low, on the dirt bench cut into the wall, below the worst drift of the powder that sifted in anyway, a fine, ceaseless flower of dust that settled on hair and shoulders and could not be helped. Cal re-wetted the bandanas from the last swallow in the canteen and rationed it. The boy's cloth wet every time, his own every other time. Water had one job left, and it was not thirst. At the stub of stovepipe by the entry, blue light appeared. Little cold beads of it, wobbling on the iron rim. St. Elmo's fire, the storm static come indoors to visit, and the dead air smelled faintly of dry lightning. Roy watched it with his eyes over the cloth, half terror and half wonder, which was the correct proportion. The boy's real fear came out later, in the long middle of the black, and he said it plainly through the bandana, the way children say the true thing. It was like being buried, like a grave with a door. Cal answered with facts, which is what a scared 9-year-old can actually hold on to. These walls had stood 3 winters before Roy could walk. This room had been warm at 40 below and cool at 110. And one more fact, the one that mattered. Roy himself had been born in this room on a February night in '26, 8 feet from where he was sitting. It was not a grave. It was the first roof he ever had, and it was holding up a storm right now with both hands. The hours went black and slow. Somewhere off west, thinned by the roar, came the sound Cal had been braced for, the bawling of the cattle at the windmill, lost and wrong. He sat with his eyes shut and listened and could do nothing, and did nothing, which cost what it cost. And somewhere in those hours, quietly, through the cloth, he told his son the thing he had only ever said once. About 26, about the tractor and the sod that had held this ground down since before any Bible he knew of, and how it had come up in long ribbons behind the plow, and how proud he had been. They had undressed this country. He took his own full share of it, and this storm overhead was the country itself, up and walking, wearing the fields of 4 states. It was not a punishment sent on anybody. It was simpler than that. Grass roots hold, bare dirt flies. They had traded the one for the other with their own hands. The boy listened and kept it. Men make speeches. Fathers under the ground in a storm say true things once. Past dark, real dark, night arriving unseen somewhere behind the brown, the roar thinned to a howl, and the howl to a long, hissing rush. The storm was getting old. The door had drifted shut again, and this time they dug from the inside, hand over hand, until the night came through. It was a strange, ruined night. The air was still thick, a hanging haze of flour-fine dust that the wet cloths still had work against. But it was breathable and moving, and the worst had rolled on south to go be somebody else's afternoon. The moon came up somewhere behind the murk and made a rust-colored smear, light enough to tell ground from sky and nothing more. Cal waited. Hole up till morning in the sure earth, or walk the mile now, at night, over a country the storm had spent 6 hours rearranging. Any other night, he waits. But a mile south, June had spent those same 6 hours sealed in a board house with a baby, not knowing whether her husband and her son were above ground or under it. Some walks you do not leave till morning. So they walked, but not on memory and not on the rusty moon. On the rails the land itself provided. The furrow line back west to the truck first. The truck sat drifted to its door handles, dead and patient. And from the truck, the long plowed lands ran south toward the house quarter. Feet on the furrow, Roy's fist in the back of Cal's belt. The blind man's road walked the same way it had been walked at 4 in the afternoon, ridge and hollow, south. And then, out of the hissing dark ahead, came the sound that Roy Mercer said he heard for the rest of his life whenever things got bad enough. A bell. Iron, unhurried, 3 strokes and a rest, 3 strokes and a rest. It was June, on the porch of the sealed house, beating the dinner triangle into the dark, as she had been doing, they learned, every few minutes for hours, on the plain reasoning that if her men were out there walking, they would be walking deaf and blind, and iron carries where lamplight drowns. She had done her own day's fighting by then, windows taped and stuffed, wet sheets nailed over the frames, and the baby asleep under a muslin tent with a wet cloth laid over it, breathing clean in a house full of brown haze. Her siege had held too. Hers always held. Cal said that to anyone who would listen, for years. They steered by the triangle the last quarter mile, wading dust drifts that lay over the yard fence like snow that had forgotten how to be cold. The lamp made a halo in the doorway. June stood in it and counted what came out of the dark at her. 2 shapes, the right sizes, walking. And she did not cry out, and she did not sit down. She opened the door wider and stood aside to let them in, which, in that family, was the whole of a psalm. Inside, the house wore its brown frost on every shelf and sill, the snow that does not melt, June called it, sweeping it for weeks. But under the muslin, the baby slept with clean breath. 4 people stood in one room and were all of them alive, and for a long minute, nobody needed one thing more than that. Morning came up through a brown gauze and showed them what one afternoon had done. Dunes stood where the road had been. The fence lines were long, soft ridges, wire and post swallowed whole. Fields lay rippled and remapped, drifted like a cold country, every color of dirt from 3 states layered on Oklahoma. The truck came out of its drift with a scoop shovel, and with the air clean, its engine woke on the second try, holding no grudge. The windmill cattle did not come out of anything. The dust had lain down in their lungs before it lay down in anyone's fields. It was so through the whole county that season, and it is enough to say it once and gently. The storm got a name inside the week and kept it, Black Sunday. And that spring, the accounts of the period say plainly, the plains buried more than cattle. The dust pneumonia took its toll of the old and the very young across the whole bowl of that country, and the newspapers printed the words Dust Bowl for the first time, and the name stuck to the land like the dust itself. The trucks began to pass the Mercer place that summer, westbound. Furniture roped high, mattresses on the cab roofs, license plates from every county around. Nobody blamed them, least of all Cal. Everyone had their own account book with that country, and many an honest one came up short. The Mercers stayed, not out of stubbornness. Cal had no sermons in him on the subject. He gave Roy the reason once, in the dooryard, watching a neighbor's loaded truck go by. The same earth that had come for them had also been the only thing that saved them. A country that will kill you and shelter you in the same afternoon is not an enemy. It is a partner you have wronged. And you can wrong a partner, or you can settle with one. The settling had already begun that same year in the shape of government soil men with maps and new words. Contour plowing, cover crops. Furrows run on the curve of the land instead of straight through it, so the field holds itself down. Stapled to the earth, Cal called it, and took to it before most, because he had heard what straight furrows sounded like going over his head at 4 in the afternoon. In time came the shelter belts, and in time, at the end of the decade, as the accounts record, came the rain, as rain does, to fields that had learned how to receive it. The dugout was never torn down. Every fall for the rest of his life, Cal Mercer went out to the north pasture and cut fresh sod and patched the roof of the old dirt house, a house nobody lived in, kept tight as a granary. June said he tended it like a grave. Cal said graves and cradles got the same care where he was raised, and left it at that. Roy Mercer grew up and farmed that same section, on the curve, the new way, and it held. And when his own grandchildren asked him, as they always ask sooner or later, about the day the sky fell, the story began where it had always begun, in the one sentence the family kept. Day went black at 4 in the afternoon. 10 steps from the truck, his father turned him away from home.